Everyone passed by the old woman trembling in the snow, as if no one wanted to hear her cry for help. But one Navy SEAL and his loyal dog stopped, and that single moment pushed them into danger. What seemed like a trapped dog in the forest soon uncovered a dark secret buried beneath the snow. Because in those woods, some traps were meant for animals, and some were meant for people who still cared. Before the night was over, trust would be broken, the truth would come out, and one choice would change everything. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to the channel. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep writing more meaningful stories. Now, let's begin the story. By the time Dorian Hale reached the county road that cut through the northern pines, the storm had stopped pretending to be weather and become something closer to force. Snow did not simply fall. It drove sideways in pale sheets, struck the windshield like thrown salt, and blurred the world beyond the glass into shifting bands of white and shadow. The road ahead came and went in fragments. 2 dark ruts, a fence post, the hunched shape of a spruce, then nothing again. Dorian kept both hands on the wheel. At 35, he had the kind of body built by repetition rather than vanity. Compact, strong through the shoulders and back, lean instead of bulky, every movement economical as if wasted motion offended him. He stood about 6 feet tall, though sitting behind the wheel in the dim cab. Height meant less than presence. His face was clean-shaven, the jaw hard and square, cheekbones marked by cold and habit, with none of the softness that came from an easy life. His dark brown hair was cropped in a military cut, though slightly longer than strict regulation, enough to show that discipline had stayed after uniform had gone. Northern wind had roughened his fair skin into a permanent faint weathering, and his gray-blue eyes carried the distant steadiness of a man who had seen too much to frighten easily and too much to judge quickly. He wore the same clothes he wore for everything that mattered: a worn military gray tactical combat shirt, soft with age and frayed faintly at the cuffs and shoulders, a dark red thermal layer visible at the collar, old earth-brown combat pants with sagging cargo pockets, battered military work boots, and an old field watch strapped to his wrist. Nothing about him looked new. Nothing about him looked decorative. He looked like a man built to continue. Beside him sat Rook. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, cream-gray-black sable from neck to tail, his coat thick enough for winter, his body rangy and athletic rather than oversized. Amber eyes watched the world with unsettling intelligence. A black harness edged in a muted dark red sat close against his chest and shoulders, the top handle worn smooth by use. Rook had the composure of a working dog who did not waste emotion on theatrics. He rarely barked without reason. He rarely moved without purpose. His silence often said more than another creature's noise. That silence broke first, not with sound, with stillness. Rook, who had spent most of the drive seated and watchful, went rigid all at once. His ears lifted, his head angled toward the windshield, then toward the passenger side window, then back again. He leaned forward without whining, and that was what caught Dorian's attention fastest. A restless dog could mean anything. A still dog meant certainty. Dorian eased his foot from the gas. "What is it?" Rook did not look at him, his gaze fixed on something ahead, something nearly swallowed by the storm. At first, Dorian saw only blowing white and the wavering edge of the road. Then, like a figure being sketched by the storm itself, a person appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the lane. She was not waving wildly. She was simply there, one hand raised, the other folded against herself as if trying to keep her ribs from rattling apart. Snow clung to her coat in thick, crusted ridges. Wind pressed the fabric hard against her thin frame. Even through the windshield, Dorian could see she was in trouble. Not ordinary cold. The dangerous kind. The kind that hollowed the mouth, sharpened the eyes, and turned every movement into something too deliberate. He slowed, then stopped. Some decisions felt like choices. Others felt like recognition. When he opened the door, cold hit him with immediate authority. It bit the exposed skin at his throat, found the seam between glove and sleeve, filled his lungs with something so sharp it seemed almost metallic. Snow hissed around his boots as he stepped down. The woman turned toward him. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older. Winter had a way of making age difficult to measure. She was small and narrow-boned, her posture bent less by weakness than by long acquaintance with hard weather. Silver hair had come loose from whatever knot had once held it, and now clung damply to the sides of her face. Her skin was pale and lined, reddened raw across the cheeks by cold. Her eyes, a faded gray, held the clear alertness of someone too stubborn to surrender to panic. Her hands were bare except for one half-pulled glove, the fingers red, cracked, and scraped as if she had been clawing through ice or brush. "Please," she said, and the word shook once in the air. "Not for me. There's a dog." Dorian glanced automatically at the tree line. Pines stood close beyond the ditch, black against the storm. "What happened?" "It's caught. In a trap." She swallowed against cold, breath hitching. "I tried. I couldn't get it loose. If it stays out there much longer—" She did not finish. Rook had already dropped from the truck. He came around the hood with quick, silent steps and stood beside Dorian, body angled toward the woods. Snow dusted his back. He looked past the woman, into the trees, and then very lightly placed one paw against Dorian's wrist. A simple touch. Not urgent, not frantic. A decision offered without force. Dorian looked down at the dog, then back at the woman. He saw then that the scrapes on her hands were fresh. He saw the tremor in her mouth, the way she held herself upright by insistence alone. He also saw something else. She had not stepped into the road to beg for her own life. She had stepped into it for an animal still out there in the storm. "All right," he said. "Show me." Relief crossed her face so quickly and so quietly it almost passed for pain. She led them off the road and into the trees. The woods swallowed sound differently from the open lane. Wind still moved there, but broken by trunks and branches. It came in shuddering gusts rather than long blows. Snow underfoot was deeper than it had looked from the road, powder over hard crust, each step a negotiation. The woman moved with surprising certainty, though she stumbled once and caught herself against a sapling with a breathless sound that made Dorian's jaw tighten. He came closer without taking her arm. Some people endured better when not handled. It was Rook who found the place first. He stopped near a fallen log half buried in drifted snow and gave one low sound, not a bark, but something nearer to a warning passing through his chest. Dorian stepped beside him and saw it. The trap was half hidden under the white, its steel jaws clamped above a dog's foreleg. The animal was medium-sized, probably mixed shepherd, black and tan under a coat now caked with snow and blood. He had worn himself nearly into collapse trying to pull free. His breathing came in hard, shallow bursts. One ear was laid back flat. The other twitched weakly at their approach. When he saw them, his lips lifted not in aggression so much as fear sharpened into reflex. The old woman's voice came from behind Dorian, thin with cold and guilt. "I found him before dawn. I thought I could do it myself." Dorian crouched. The trap was not homemade junk. It was maintained, heavy, and meant to hold. A chain ran from it into the snow where it had been staked beneath the ground. Someone had set this properly. Someone expected to come back. The dog jerked when Dorian reached toward the metal. Teeth flashed once. "Easy," Dorian said quietly. He took in the mechanism, the angle, the pressure points. Training returned the way it always did, not as memory, but as function. He slid gloved fingers into the packed snow around the hinge, cleared enough ice away to reach the spring, shifted his weight, and pressed. The steel resisted, then moved with a harsh little shriek. The dog made a broken sound and tried to wrench backward. Rook remained just outside reach, rigid but calm, head low, offering presence without pressure. For 1 second, the trap held. Then it opened. Dorian pulled the wounded leg free and let the jaws snap shut harmlessly beside him. Blood welled dark against the snow. The dog tried to crawl, failed, and collapsed onto his side, trembling so hard his ribs shook. The old woman dropped to her knees with less caution than sense. "There now," she murmured, though her own hands were shaking too badly to help much. "There now." Dorian stripped off his outer scarf, wrapped the injured leg tightly enough to slow the bleeding, and checked the animal's eyes. Still responsive. Still fighting. That was when the rehook came not in words, but in the way Rook abruptly turned from the dog and looked back toward the road. His whole body changed. Ears high, spine taut. Breath held. He stared into the trees behind them with such fixed intensity that for a moment Dorian forgot the cold, forgot the blood, forgot the woman kneeling in the snow. He followed the line of Rook's gaze and saw, far between the trunks, a pale movement. Not storm, not branch. Light. A vehicle. And though it was still some distance away, Dorian felt the prickling certainty that whoever had come was not surprised to find them here. He lifted the injured dog carefully, one arm under chest and hindquarters, and stood. The animal shuddered but did not snap again. The woman rose more slowly, breath ragged now, one hand pressed to her side. "We need to get you both out," Dorian said. She nodded, but her eyes had gone past him too, toward the approaching light. By the time they reached the road, snow had nearly erased their tracks. Dorian set the injured dog gently inside the truck, where Rook immediately jumped in and settled beside him, close enough to guard, far enough not to crowd. The old woman had one hand on the open passenger door when the other vehicle rolled to a stop behind them. The cruiser's lights did not flash. Its engine idled. A man stepped out wearing a winter sheriff's coat darkened with wet snow at the shoulders. He was in his 50s, perhaps, tall enough to carry authority without effort, his movements measured and unhurried. His face was broad but composed, the sort of face small towns trusted because it rarely showed alarm. He removed one glove with his teeth, not because he needed to, but because he was taking his time. Deputy Nolan Bryce. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to sound helpful. "What happened out here?" Dorian straightened. Snow ran down the back of his collar. The old woman had gone very still. Nolan's eyes moved once over the woman, the blood on Dorian's gloves, the dog in the truck, and then settled on Dorian's face. He did not ask whether the dog was alive. He did not ask whether the woman needed heat. He asked with quiet precision, "Where did you find it?" The truck heater clicked and rattled with the tired persistence of a machine that had survived too many winters to quit out of pride alone. Warm air moved through the cab in uneven breaths, never quite enough to erase the cold that had climbed into their clothes and settled there. Dorian drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly near the emergency brake, more from habit than need. The road was still a guess scratched through white, but the worst of the immediate urgency had shifted. The old woman was inside. The injured dog was inside. Rook was inside. That mattered. Deputy Nolan Bryce followed for perhaps half a mile, then pulled alongside briefly before easing ahead and turning his cruiser around in a slow, controlled arc, the tires crunching over packed snow. "Take the next right after the split," he had said through the cracked window, his tone courteous, almost helpful. "Her place is tucked back farther than it looks." Then he had studied Dorian for one beat too long, and added, "Storm's thickening. Don't linger if you don't have to." The advice had been reasonable. That was what bothered Dorian. Reasonable words, calmly delivered, with nothing in them a man could point to and call wrong. Yet the weight of that earlier question still sat in the truck with him. Where did you find it? Not, is it bad? Not, did she fall? But the exact location. The question of a man measuring information, not offering care. The old woman sat bundled in the passenger seat, both hands wrapped around the edge of a wool blanket Dorian had thrown over her shoulders. Up close in the shifting dash light, she looked older than she had in the road, and somehow less fragile. Her face was narrow, her skin pale and winter-worn, with a web of fine lines around the mouth and at the corners of the eyes. Her silver hair, damp from snow, had begun to dry in stubborn wisps against her temples. She was small, but not delicate. There was a compactness to her, a shape formed by years of doing difficult things without asking whether anyone would come help. In the back, the trapped dog lay on an old blanket Dorian kept folded behind the seat. He was awake now, barely. Black and tan coat, matted by melted snow and blood, ribs just a little too visible beneath the fur, one foreleg bandaged rough, but secure. Every so often he lifted his head an inch, then let it fall again. Rook sat beside him, turned halfway toward the animal, and halfway toward the rear window, guarding without intrusion. The shepherd's cream-gray-black sable coat caught the weak cab light in soft, dark waves, and his amber eyes never fully rested. He did not sniff the injured dog again. He simply stayed close enough to say that the animal was no longer alone. The woman cleared her throat. "You didn't have to keep driving." Dorian kept his eyes on the road. "I wasn't going to leave you standing out there. That wasn't what I meant." He glanced at her then, just briefly. She was looking not at him, but at the dog in the back seat, with the kind of attention that belonged less to pity than to responsibility. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evelyn Pike." He nodded once. "Dorian." "I know." That made him look at her again. She gave the faintest hint of a tired smile. "Nolan said your name when he spoke to you. I may be old, Mr. Hale, I'm not deaf." Something about the dryness of it nearly pulled a smile from him before the expression died halfway. He had known people who used humor to charm, and people who used it to disarm. Evelyn Pike used it the way some people used a walking stick, not to impress anyone, only because it helped across rough ground. They took the right turn Nolan had mentioned and left the county road for something narrower. Pines closed in around them. Snow lay deeper here, pushed into long ridges by the wind. The truck rocked and dipped through buried ruts, and twice Dorian thought he had lost the track entirely, but Evelyn would murmur, "A little left," or "past the birch, not before it," and the path would reveal itself again in fragments. The house appeared all at once, a low structure half tucked behind a stand of dark cedar, its roof burdened with snow, one porch light burning yellow through the storm. Wood smoke drifted from the chimney in a wavering gray ribbon. There was nothing grand or picturesque about it. It looked, instead, like a place that had outlasted many winters by refusing to pretend they were beautiful. Before Dorian had even set the truck in park, something moved under the porch rail. A dog burst from the shadow. Not big like Rook. Smaller, older, with a rough sandy brown coat gone pale around the muzzle, and one ear that folded crookedly at the tip. He came through the snow in a half-run, half-bounce, paws punching through drifts, tail beating hard enough to throw powder in little white arcs. He did not bark. He made a sound closer to a cry of relief and skidded to a halt beside Evelyn's door, standing on his hind legs for 1 second to place muddy paws against the frame. "Well, I know," Evelyn murmured, and now the smile on her face was real, though faint. "I'm late." Dorian opened her door, and the old dog immediately pressed his head against her knee, quivering with joy so absolute it bordered on grief. He was perhaps 8 or 9, maybe older, the sort of mixed-breed mutt whose face had become expressive from living too near people. One cloudy eye, one clear brown one, scar tissue along the flank under thinning fur. He smelled of dry straw and old wood and dog sleep. He adored her with shameless totality. "He's yours?" Dorian asked. Evelyn touched the dog's head with red, scraped fingers. "No," she said. "He simply never left." That answer stayed with him while he rounded the truck to get the injured dog. The house was warmer than he expected, and neater too. Not neat in the polished sense, useful neat. Boots lined under a bench, towels folded and stacked, glass jars labeled in a hand that leaned hard to the right. A smell of pine cleaner, old wool, broth, and dog fur hung in the air. The front room had been taken over in pieces by animal life, without losing its human shape. A crate in one corner, blankets in another, 2 mismatched bowls drying by the stove. Dorian lowered the wounded dog onto a quilt spread near the heater. The animal stiffened, eyes wide, but did not fight. Rook entered after him, shoulders rolling smoothly under the harness, and took up his place a short distance away, sitting instead of looming. "You've done this before," Dorian said. Evelyn had already gone to a cupboard. She glanced back over her shoulder. "Enough." The answer was short, but the room filled in the rest. The salve jars, the cut strips of linen, the old kennel tags hanging from a nail by the sink. Not a rescue center, not anything official, something quieter, something built one dog at a time and with no expectation of praise. She returned with a basin, a clean cloth, and a bottle of diluted antiseptic. Her hands shook from cold more than age, but the shaking lessened once she began to work. As Evelyn crouched beside the wounded dog, Rook, who had not left his watchful post, rose and crossed the space between them. He did not go to the injured animal. He went to Evelyn. He lowered his head once, slowly, and pressed the side of his muzzle against the back of her wounded hand. It was not affection in the ordinary way. It looked almost like recognition. Evelyn froze. For one strange, suspended second, her clear gray eyes widened, not with fear, but with something older and harder to name. She looked at Rook, as if the dog had touched not her skin, but some hidden memory beneath it. Then she swallowed, rested her uninjured palm gently against his neck, and whispered so quietly Dorian almost thought he imagined it. "You remember gentleness better than people do." Rook stepped back, as if the moment had never happened. Yet the air in the room changed around it, carrying some signal Dorian could feel but not read. He busied himself by unfastening his gloves. After a few minutes, he asked the question that had been waiting since the drive. "Why not take them to a shelter?" Evelyn did not answer immediately. She dabbed the cloth around the swollen leg, careful, patient, letting the dog breathe between touches. Only when she was sure he would not thrash did she speak. "Because once," she said, "I trusted one." Her tone did not sharpen. If anything, it quieted further. That made it hit harder. He was younger than this one, hit by a truck in March. I brought him in because everyone said that was what decent people did. She wrung out the cloth. 3 days later, they told me they'd transferred him. Nobody could tell me where. Paperwork wrong, they said. A misunderstanding. Her mouth moved once, not quite a smile. Animals disappear very easily when too many tired people are trying to do too much with too little. Dorian leaned against the table edge, arms folded. So you kept the next one? I kept the next few. He looked around again at the room, at the old dog by the door, at the shepherd mix trembling on the quilt. How many are there? Depends on the season. Then, after the smallest pause, and on how much badness is loose in the woods. There was a knock at the front door. Not loud, not hesitant either. Evelyn went still, and in that stillness Dorian understood immediately that whoever stood outside belonged to a category she had expected, not welcomed. I'll get it, he said. But she was already moving. When she opened the door, the wind came in first, followed by a man shaped broadly against the storm. He was somewhere in his late 60s, perhaps, tall enough to seem imposing even with his shoulders bent under a heavy canvas coat. His beard was gray and uneven, not from fashion but from neglect, and the cold had reddened the hard planes of his face. One eye narrowed a little more than the other, as if from an old injury. He carried a crowbar in one gloved hand and a coil of chain in the other. Snow clung to the brim of his hat. Everything about him looked like weather had tried to ruin him, and failed only part way. He stepped over the threshold, stopped when he saw Dorian, and the room changed temperature without losing any heat. This him? The man asked. Evelyn answered before Dorian could. Gideon, this is Dorian Hale. He's the one who stopped. Gideon Pike set the crowbar against the wall with deliberate care. His gaze moved over Dorian's face, down his clothes, to the old military watch, then back up again. He had the kind of stare some older men carried after grief had replaced curiosity. Direct, unadorned, unwilling to spend politeness where trust had not yet been earned. Stopped for the dog, Gideon said. For her, Dorian replied. Something unreadable shifted in the man's expression and disappeared just as quickly. Evelyn, perhaps sensing the tension hardening into shape, said softly, almost apologetically, "He doesn't take to new people." Gideon did not look at her. "No," he said. "I don't take to uniforms." Dorian almost said he was not in one. But that would have been technical and cowardly, and both men would have known it. So he said only, "Fair enough." Gideon's eyes flicked toward him again, measuring that answer too. Then he looked down at the wounded dog, and the line beside his mouth deepened. "That trap was checked recently," he said. "Chain still clean. They're running them closer to the road now." Dorian straightened from the table. "Who's they?" Gideon met his gaze. For a moment, in the tight quiet of that dog-filled room, Dorian had the distinct feeling he stood just outside the edge of something larger than he had intended to enter. Gideon's answer, when it came, was flat as frozen ground. "That," he said, "depends on who you still think deserves the benefit of doubt." By morning, the storm had thinned from fury into residue. The world outside Evelyn Pike's house no longer looked like a place under attack. It looked, instead, like a place pretending nothing had happened. Snow lay smooth and pale over the yard. The pines stood black and still. Thin winter light stretched across the drifts with that strange northern brightness that made everything visible without making anything warm. It was the kind of morning that could fool a careless person into thinking danger had passed. Dorian Hale knew better. He stood on the porch, pulling on his gloves, Gray-blue eyes narrowed against the light. The old military gray tactical shirt he wore beneath his heavier outer layer still held the stiffness of dried snow near the cuffs. His dark brown hair, cut short in the old, disciplined way, had flattened on one side during the few hours of sleep he had managed in a chair by the stove. Sleep had not softened him. Nothing about Dorian softened easily. Not the hard line of his square jaw, not the lean set of his shoulders, not the quiet economy in the way he moved. He looked like a man who had long ago learned that comfort was unreliable, and therefore not worth depending on. Rook waited beside him, black harness edged with dark red, catching a sliver of light. The German shepherd had slept little, too. His sable coat cream, gray and black woven together like winter brush, still held a few dried crystals of snow at the haunches. His amber eyes tracked the tree line, then the road, then Dorian. He was not restless. He was measuring. Behind them, Evelyn was packing a canvas satchel with bandages, wire cutters, a thermos, and a folded square of old wool blanket. "You should stay in today," Dorian said without turning. "The drifts are still unstable in the lower trail." From the table, Gideon Pike made a sound that was not quite a laugh and had no humor in it. "Listen to that," the older man said. "One day in the county and he's already giving weather advice like a deputy." Gideon looked different in daylight than he had the night before. Harder, somehow. He was tall even with age beginning to pull at his spine, broad through the chest from a lifetime of work, with a face weathered into sharp planes and bitterness, gray beard rough across the jaw, deep lines around the mouth, eyes pale and unsparing beneath heavy brows. The sort of man who seemed carved instead of born. Nothing in him invited ease. Evelyn cast him a look over one shoulder. He's not wrong. He's not local either. Dorian let that go. He had known men like Gideon before, men whose grief had dried into suspicion, whose anger had outlived its original flame and settled into the structure of them. Argument rarely moved such men. Time sometimes did. Deeds, more often. He stepped off the porch into the white glare of the yard. Rook followed immediately. Behind them came the scrape of Gideon's boots, then Evelyn's lighter steps. The old dog from the house patch, Dorian had learned over weak coffee an hour earlier, watched from the doorway, tail low but wagging once, as if he understood that leaving had become a ritual in this place. They found the first trap less than a mile from the house. It was hidden under wind-packed powder near a brush line, where the snow drifted deeper than it looked. Rook's ears lifted before any human eye saw the sign. Then Gideon spotted the disturbed crust near a stunted cedar, knelt, and brushed away enough snow to reveal the steel teeth beneath. "Fresh," he muttered. Dorian crouched beside him. The metal was clean. Too clean. Someone had set it recently and checked it recently, too. No rust in the hinge, no hard ice in the catch. "Whoever's running these," Dorian said, "they're staying on a pattern." Gideon rose slowly. "They always do." There were no animals in that trap, not this time, but another lay farther upslope, and in that one they found blood. Not much. Enough. By noon they had found 3 more. At the 4th, the smell hit before the sight did. Iron, fur, frozen waste, fear. It was a young hound mix this time, red, brown, and white, maybe 2 years old, ears too large for his head, ribs showing through a thin winter coat. He was still alive when they reached him, but only barely. His breathing came shallow and irregular, his muzzle crusted with frost where breath had frozen and thawed, and frozen again. One paw was mangled where he had twisted against the trap until flesh had torn. Evelyn dropped beside him with a low sound that came from deeper than pity. Dorian went to work immediately, gloved hands sure at the springs, while Gideon scanned the woods. Rook stood over the hound's shoulder, not touching, just watching with that grave canine intensity that sometimes felt too close to thought. The trap came free. The dog did not survive the next 2 minutes. Evelyn kept one hand on his chest even after the motion had stopped, as if warmth might bargain with death if offered enough patience. Her lined face had gone still in that dangerous way strong people went still when they had no room left for fresh anger. "We were close," she said at last. Gideon looked down at the dead dog, then away. "Not close enough." The sentence hung there heavier than the sky. Word traveled faster than weather in small places. That afternoon, when Dorian stopped at the general store near the fork road for motor oil and more gauze, conversations dimmed when he came through the door. The store itself was long and narrow, warm with old heater fumes and the smell of feed grain, tobacco, and coffee that had sat too long on a burner. Behind the counter stood Ruth Bell, a woman in her late 50s with a broad farm wife face, strong forearms, and practical gray hair braided and pinned back from a forehead always shining faintly from work. She had the kindest mouth in the county and eyes sharp enough to tally weakness at 20 paces. She greeted him politely. Too politely. "You're the new transfer," she said, handing him the oil without asking if he needed help finding it. "That obvious? In a place this small?" She shrugged. "Everything is." Two men by the freezer aisle stopped speaking when Rook turned his head toward them. One of them, thick-necked and red-cheeked from cold and drink, looked away first. Ruth lowered her voice while ringing him up. "People are talking." Dorian set cash on the counter. "About what?" She hesitated long enough to make the answer matter. "About timing." Then, because decency still fought in her, she added, "You know how folks are? They look for shape in things." He knew exactly how folks were. Outside, in the hard white parking lot, Deputy Nolan Bryce waited by his cruiser as if the meeting had been arranged. He stood with one hand resting on the roof, dark winter uniform immaculate despite the slush, silver badge catching the washed-out sun. In daylight, he looked every inch what the town believed him to be. Dependable, controlled, the sort of man who would arrive when called and keep his voice steady while doing it. He smiled, and the smile was almost enough. "Heard you were helping the Pikes," Nolan said. Dorian opened the truck door, but did not get in yet. "That a problem?" "No problem at all." Nolan's tone stayed easy. "Just don't want folks misreading things. Outsiders come in, traps get found, dogs get hurt, people start stitching stories together." "Stories convenient to who?" A tiny pause. So small another man might have missed it. "To fear," Nolan said smoothly. "Small towns have a lot of it." Rook gave one low breath through his nose. Not a growl, an opinion. Nolan glanced at the dog, then back to Dorian. "I'm on your side here." That should have reassured him. Instead, something in Dorian went colder. They had brought back another injured dog, this one alive, a rangy black female with one torn ear and eyes so wary they looked wild even while accepting water from a bowl. Dorian was at the sink washing blood from his hands when Rook, lying by the door, lifted his head sharply toward the window. No bark, just focus. He crossed the room in 3 silent steps and stopped beneath the glass, staring at the snowy dark beyond the porch with the kind of absolute attention that made everyone else still instinctively. Evelyn set down the spoon she had been stirring broth with. Gideon rose from the table. Dorian pulled the curtain aside 2 fingers' width. Out in the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light, stood a figure. Still. Watching. Then, as if aware of being seen, it moved back behind the line of cedar and vanished. No tracks were visible from the window. only the suggestion of absence where something had interrupted the snow. "Did you see who?" Evelyn whispered. "No." Gideon's face darkened with something that looked too familiar to be surprise. "They know this house." Dorian let the curtain fall. "Or they want you to know they do." No one said what all of them were thinking. That warning was more intimate than threat. Threat meant distance. This meant observation. By the next morning, the feeling of being watched had turned practical. A woman at the feedlot avoided Dorian's eyes. A man at the gas pump stopped mid-greeting when he realized who he was speaking to. Two boys on bicycles stared openly, one whispering something that made the other laugh and look ashamed of it. None of it would have mattered much by itself. Together it formed a pattern. Not rejection exactly. Positioning. By afternoon, even Gideon noticed. "Told you," the old man said while kneeling over a sprung trap near the creek line. "They don't need to accuse you. They just need to make everyone step back half a pace." Dorian used the pry bar to lift a chain buried in ice. "Who taught them that?" Gideon yanked the trap loose and stood, his pale eyes fixed on Dorian's face with a severity that came from far away and had lived a long time in him. "The same man my son trusted," he said. For the first time, he did not say it with simple anger. He said it with certainty. The day ended with another dog lost, and no proof strong enough to hold in the hand. Dorian drove back to Evelyn's house through gathering dusk with Rook silent beside him, and the taste of failure sitting metallic at the back of his mouth. He had survived places where failure came with fire, radio static, and the blunt mathematics of war. This was worse in a quieter way. This was slow. This spread. This turned people's faces from you 1 degree at a time until you looked up and found yourself alone. When they reached the house, Patch whined from the porch before the truck had even stopped. Warm light spilled from the windows. Inside, broth simmered. The injured black dog slept near the heater, one ear twitching in dream or pain. Dorian took off his gloves and stood for a moment in that small, dog-crowded room, listening to the stove tick. Then Gideon, who had set down his coat and gone to the shelf by the door, spoke without looking at him. "My boy used to come home with that same face." Dorian turned. Gideon's expression had not softened. Men like him did not soften. But the line of his mouth had shifted enough to make room for something else. Not trust, not yet. Recognition. "He'd say he was working the truth," Gideon went on. "Then one day the truth started working him." Dorian held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved again through the trees like something searching. Inside, with dogs breathing in uneven sleep and old pain taking shape around them, Dorian understood that whatever had begun on the road in the snow was no longer a matter of one trap, one dog, one storm, or one old woman's plea. Something in this county had begun to bend, and it was bending people with it. The next 2 days taught Dorian Hale that isolation did not always arrive as silence. Sometimes it arrived as a turned shoulder in a feed store. Sometimes as a conversation that ended when he stepped close enough to hear it. Sometimes as a man at the gas pump who nodded once, then changed his mind and looked away. The county had not declared him guilty of anything. That would have been easier to meet head-on. What it had done instead was more subtle, and, in its way, more effective. It had shifted him half an inch outside the circle of ordinary trust and left him there. By the third morning after the dead hound, Dorian stopped trying to force his way back into that circle. He left Evelyn Pike's house before dawn, when the snow still glowed blue under the moon, and the trees held their breath before first light. He moved quietly through the kitchen, filling a thermos with black coffee while the stove murmured to itself. Evelyn was asleep in the back room, or pretending to be. Gideon Pike had gone out sometime before 3. Dorian had heard the porch boards complain once, then the low crunch of boots fading into the dark. That old man seemed to believe rest was a kind of surrender. Dorian understood the instinct too well to resent it. Rook waited by the mudroom door, already harnessed. The German shepherd's sable coat cream, gray and black woven together like cold smoke, caught the lamplight in muted bands. He stood with the compact, controlled patience of a working dog who understood departure before commands were given. The amber in his eyes had changed over the last few days. Not softened, sharpened. Rook had begun to track the tension in the county the way another dog might track weather. He knew when voices cooled. He knew when Dorian's breathing changed at night. He knew, perhaps better than Dorian did, that they were no longer moving through a place that merely held danger. They were moving through a place that had noticed them. Dorian pulled on his old work boots and checked the knife at his belt, the flashlight in his pocket, the folded map tucked inside his jacket. The military gray tactical combat shirt beneath his heavier coat felt familiar in the way scars did. The fabric had long ago softened with wear, the cuffs slightly frayed, the shoulders faded from years of weather and washing. His dark red thermal layer held warmth close to the skin. The old military watch at his wrist ticked with indifferent accuracy. None of it was ceremonial. He dressed the way he always had when stepping into uncertainty, with as little waste between intention and action as possible. He drove north first. North had been Nolan Bryce's suggestion the evening before, offered in that calm, measured way the deputy used when speaking like a man burdened by responsibility. 2 trap reports came in near the old rail cut, Nolan had said, one elbow hooked casually over the roof of his cruiser. If I were you, that's where I'd start. If I were you. Dorian had learned long ago to distrust a helpful tone more than an openly hostile one. Helpfulness hid motive better. The rail cut was empty. Not empty in the harmless sense. Empty in the way a room felt after someone had rushed through it, clearing signs of their own presence. Snow around the broken embankment had been disturbed, then half covered again. A stake hole had been filled. One patch of crust bore the clean oval mark of something heavy lifted out not long before. Rook moved from one sign to the next, nose low, body taut, then looked up at Dorian once with an expression that always seemed 1 degree too intelligent. "We're late," Dorian said. Not because he had misread the place, because someone had known he was coming. He tried Nolan's second suggestion that afternoon, a low cedar flat west of the frozen creek. Same result. A sprung trap. Fresh human prints layered over older snowshoe tracks. No animal, no chain, no useful trace left except absence. By evening he no longer felt misled in theory. He felt handled. That was the part that lodged like grit under the skin. Dorian Hale had spent years in environments where mistakes were fatal, where the distance between correct and incorrect could be measured in heartbeats and blood loss. He knew how to be wrong. He knew how to recover from wrong. What he could not abide was the sensation of another mind quietly arranging his failures in advance. Back at Evelyn's that night, Gideon sat at the table sharpening an old skinning knife with slow, even strokes. The older man's face, all weathered planes and gray beard, did not invite confession. He had the look of someone whose grief had calcified into function. Even his silences seemed filed to an edge. "Well?" Gideon asked without looking up. Dorian set down the map. "North was scrubbed clean before I got there. A single pass of the whetstone. And west?" "Same." That made Gideon lift his head. There was no surprise in his pale eyes. Only a hard, bitter confirmation, as if Dorian had just spoken aloud something Gideon had been forcing himself not to name too early. "You still taking Bryce's directions?" he asked. "For now." That answer drew the nearest thing to approval Dorian had seen from him. Not because it suggested trust in Nolan, because it suggested method. Evelyn, who was binding gauze around the black female dog they had rescued 2 nights earlier, glanced between them. In the yellow stove light, she looked smaller than ever, silver hair pinned back carelessly, lined face shadowed with fatigue. But her hands, though reddened and chapped by winter, moved with calm precision. She had become more than caretaker in Dorian's mind. She was the kind of person who had built usefulness out of sorrow, one practical act at a time. "You think he's wrong on purpose," she said softly. "I think," Dorian answered, "someone knows where I'm going before I get there." Gideon laid the knife down. "And now? Now I stop walking exactly where I'm told." No one argued. The next morning he did the opposite. Instead of heading toward the trap line Nolan had casually mentioned at the gas station, Dorian cut east through a strip of birch and aspen where the snow lay shallower under the bare branches. Rook worked ahead in short arcs, pausing often, checking the air as much as the ground. The sky stayed low and white, not storming, not clear, the kind of flat winter sky that drained depth from distance. Dorian moved with a soldier's habit of reading terrain, constantly tree spacing, drift patterns, the way old prints held or failed to hold under new snow. For 3 hours they found nothing. Not just no traps. Nothing. No sign of recent human passage, no blood, no wire, no bait remnants. It was as if he had stepped out of the county's hidden map entirely. And for one hot, humiliating minute, anger turned inward. Maybe Gideon had been right to distrust him. Maybe Nolan, for all Dorian's suspicion, had simply known the ground better. Maybe this entire stubborn refusal to follow instruction had become exactly what the town already suspected. One more outsider confusing discipline for insight. He stopped by a deadfall and crouched to rest one hand on Rook's neck. The dog's breathing was steady. His ears twitched once. Then he turned his head and pressed his nose not to the snow, but toward Dorian's left side, near the pocket where he kept a pair of old leather gloves. Rook sniffed again. Longer this time. Then he moved away sharply and stood facing upslope. Dorian frowned. He took out the gloves. The left one smelled as it should have. Leather, cold, a trace of pine resin from yesterday. The right one held something else. Faint, chemical, sweet in the wrong way. Not forest, not oil, not blood. A lure. The realization came not as drama, but as a rearrangement of meaning. Whatever scent had caught Rook's attention had touched Dorian's things first. Not by accident. Someone had come near his truck, his gear, his space, someone close enough to plant what they needed and confident enough to believe he would not notice until too late. Not a revelation shouted into the world, but a small, invisible trespass that changed the size of the enemy. Dorian slid the glove back into his pocket with deliberate care. "They've been close," he murmured. Rook did not look at him. He was already moving uphill, slower now, following a thread too subtle for human senses. Dorian went after him, pulse quiet and hard in his throat. The scent line ran broken and strange through the timber. It appeared, vanished, appeared again. Whoever had laid it knew enough to avoid making a clean trail. Dorian kept visual contact, then lost it once when Rook slipped between 2 thick firs and out over a rise. He quickened his pace, boots punching through crust, breath steaming in short bursts. "Rook." No answer, of course, only the hush of snow and branch. He crested the rise and saw the track line split around a cluster of rock and brush. One side held faint sign, the other none at all. For half a second he hesitated. Half a second was sometimes all bad luck needed. A soft metallic snap sounded somewhere ahead and below, not loud, almost elegant. Then silence. Dorian's body moved before thought caught up. He dropped downslope, one hand catching a pine trunk to keep balance, the other already reaching for the knife at his belt. Snow sprayed up around his boots. Branches clawed at his sleeves. "Rook!" Still nothing. He found the first sign at the edge of a shallow gully. Scuffed snow, one dark hair caught on the bark of a young spruce, a drag mark no wider than a forearm and nearly erased already by wind-blown powder. He knelt, touched the mark, and felt the truth land cleanly. This had not been a wild snare. This had been engineered. No blood, no struggle spread wide, no chaos, a controlled capture, a restrained animal taken fast and moved faster. Dorian searched outward in widening circles until the light began to flatten toward dusk. He found what remained because the people who had done this had been good, not perfect. A strip of cloth twisted under a thorn bush, faintly carrying the same sweet, wrong scent from his glove. A compressed patch where a crate or sled had been set down. A boot edge near the gully lip, half filled with drift, the heel pattern too clean to belong to a farmer or hunter walking old county ground. By the time he stood, the cold had gone beyond discomfort into punishment. His face felt carved from ice. The gray blue of evening had settled under the trees. Rook was gone. Dorian looked over the white slope, the dark trunks, the places where a dog should have been and wasn't. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerously close to helplessness, not fear of what might happen in a fight, something worse, the knowledge that this had not happened because he was careless once. It had happened because someone had studied him. Someone had laid a hand on the edges of his life and learned exactly where to cut. When he finally turned back toward Evelyn's house, he did so with one certainty stripped raw and undeniable in him. This was no longer a hunt moving past him through the county. This was a trap, and it had been set for him. By the end of the third day without Rook, Dorian Hale understood that hunger changed shape after a while. At first it had been physical, a hollow grind under the ribs, the sharp edge in the mouth, the small shaking weakness that came when blood sugar dropped and the body, offended by neglect, began to complain. But that part faded into something dull and manageable. What remained was another kind of hunger altogether, the starving of habit, of certainty, of the second living presence that had occupied every quiet space beside him for years. He drove back toward Evelyn Pike's house through late afternoon light that made the snowfields look bruised blue under the pines. The road curved between frozen ditches and cedar shadow, and every dark shape at the tree line struck him for one raw second as possibility. Rook's silhouette, a movement, a miracle. Each time it became only brush, stump, wind-carved drift. The mind, once desperate, became vulgar in its willingness to invent hope. Dorian had not shaved. A faint roughness darkened his jaw now, not enough to soften the hard, military angles of his face, but enough to make him look less composed than usual. His eyes had sunk deeper over the last 3 days. The gray-blue turned cold and distant in a way that had nothing to do with weather. He still wore the same old tactical combat shirt under his coat, the same earth-toned combat pants, the same boots whitened at the seams by road salt and packed snow. But now his clothes carried the stale smell of sleeplessness, truck cab air, pine resin, and the long, damp scent of time spent searching in winter woods. He pulled up outside Evelyn's place after dusk. The porch light was on. So was the lamp in the front room. Patch, the old sandy-brown dog with the cloudy eye and crooked ear, barked once from inside, not alarm, only announcement. Dorian killed the engine and sat for a second with both hands on the wheel. He had imagined this moment badly. In his head, while he drove, he had thought of what he would say and hated every version of it. Men like him were trained to ask for coordinates, supply lists, extraction windows. Not help. Help implied need, and need implied exposure. He had spent enough years in places where exposure got things killed to distrust the act of it down in the bone. But 3 days of failure had stripped pride down to its useful shape. When he stepped into the house, warmth struck his face hard enough to make his eyes sting. Evelyn looked up from the stove. She had a kettle in one hand and a cloth in the other, silver hair loosely pinned, the lines around her mouth deepened by fatigue. She was small, narrow-shouldered, weathered by age and northern winters, yet there was something in her posture that remained stubbornly upright even when she was tired, some old covenant with endurance she had never broken. She saw his face and asked no questions. That, more than kindness, nearly undid him. Gideon sat at the table with his coat still on, one rough hand laid flat over a spread of old papers. The older man's beard had gone mostly silver, except for a few dark remnants near the chin, and the scar-like grooves on either side of his nose made him look permanently suspicious of mercy. His broad shoulders had thickened once with labor, and then narrowed again under grief, but they still carried a residual strength. He looked up slowly, eyes pale as lake ice, and Dorian saw in them not contempt this time, but recognition of something he had waited a long time to see. Defeat, not the weak kind, the honest kind. Dorian reached into his coat pocket and laid Rook's collar on the table. The leather was still warm from his body. The brass ring gave a small dead sound against the wood. "I thought I could do it alone," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared it once, then tried again. "I thought if I kept moving, kept reading the ground, kept trusting the dog's patterns and my own—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "I can't." The room stayed quiet except for the stove's low ticking. He looked at Gideon, because that was harder than looking at Evelyn, and therefore necessary. "I'm asking." No man in the room missed what that cost. Gideon studied him for so long, Dorian almost thought he might refuse out of principle or habit, or the old injury of having once trusted the wrong uniform. Then the older man leaned back in the chair and let out a breath that seemed to carry 10 winters in it. "I know," he said. The simple answer landed harder than anything sympathetic might have. Evelyn crossed the room, took the kettle off the stove, and poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, without asking whether Dorian wanted it. She set it beside the collar and touched the table once with the backs of her fingers, almost absent-mindedly, as if anchoring the moment so it would not turn theatrical. Gideon unfolded the papers beneath his hand. They were not official documents in the clean, bureaucratic sense. Time had softened and curled them. Edges had gone gray. Pencil marks scored across photocopied maps. There were names written in the margins, dates circled, route notes, weather notes, coordinates, question marks stabbed hard enough to nearly tear the page. A man's private investigation, carried past its proper end by obsession and love. "My son left these," Gideon said. Dorian had heard the outline before. Son, police officer, investigation, death. But outlines were not the same as weight. Gideon pushed the top sheet toward him. The photograph clipped there showed a younger man in uniform, standing beside a patrol truck with a winter hat in one gloved hand. Early 30s. Strong face, strong. Same eyes as Gideon, only not yet sharpened by betrayal. His mouth had the beginning of a smile, as if he distrusted posing but tolerated it for whoever held the camera. A wedding ring shone on his hand. "He was called Luke," Gideon said. "Deputy Luke Pike. Didn't stay green for long. Thought the badge meant if you saw wrong, you moved toward it." He did not say whether that had been pride or goodness. In some men, it was both. He started looking into missing dogs 3 winters back. At first, everyone thought it was the usual animals straying. Bad weather, coyotes, bad owners. Then he started finding signs. Same type of anchor points, same style of cut wire, same stretches of back road where tracks disappeared too clean. Gideon tapped the map once with a thick finger. He thought it was organized before anyone wanted to hear that word. Dorian bent over the pages. Notes, trap sites, narrow roads, a pattern beginning to emerge in clusters. Evelyn said quietly. "He told us not to talk about it much. Said if he was wrong, he didn't want panic. If he was right, he didn't want anyone in the way." A bitter half-smile moved through Gideon's beard. "He got that from me. The bad habit of trying to protect people by leaving them blind." Gideon reached into the box beside him and withdrew a folded evidence bag, the kind police used for personal effects. Inside lay a torn square of dark fabric and something clipped to it, an old metal service pin bent nearly in half. Dorian stared at it, then looked up. "It's from a deputy's winter coat," Gideon said. The older man's face did not move, but something inside it had hardened past anger into something more dangerous. Clarity. Luke found it snagged on barbed wire 1/2 a mile from where he made the call. He wrote down that detail, wrote that he wasn't alone anymore, wrote he needed backup. Dorian's hand tightened around the mug until the heat bit into his palm. "The call went through Nolan," Evelyn said. No one in the room pretended not to know what that meant. Gideon turned to the last page of Luke Pike's notes. The handwriting here had deteriorated. Shorter lines, pressed harder. A man writing in cold, or pain, or urgency. Dorian read the line twice before it fully struck. Not too late if he sends them now. The now in that sentence seemed to go on living inside the room long after Gideon stopped speaking. "He called in his position," the old man said. "Clear as day. We know because the dispatch log caught part of it. Nolan was nearest. Nolan answered. Told him to hold. Told him he'd move units." Gideon's voice never rose. That made every word more exact. "He didn't move anybody." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "When the others finally went out," Gideon continued, "the weather had worsened. They found Luke against a tree line, gun still drawn, radio dead from cold. He'd crawled farther than anyone expected. Like he thought if he just stayed moving a little longer, help would turn real." Dorian said nothing. He had seen men die in combat. He had seen the body give out under blood loss, blast force, drowning panic, fire. But there was something uniquely obscene about death by waiting. About the human body kept alive by belief for longer than circumstance deserved. Gideon looked at him across the table. "Nolan didn't shoot him," he said. "Didn't stab him. Didn't lay hands on him. He just let the weather do the part he didn't want witnessed." The word settled in Dorian with a cold heavier than any outside. It reframed everything. The careful directions, the almost helpfulness, the measured patience, the confidence of a man who had survived not by brute force alone, but by understanding where delay could kill just as cleanly as violence. "Why wasn't he exposed then?" Dorian asked. "Because he was smarter than grief," Gideon said. "At first." He slid another paper over. Dispatch copies. Time stamps. Redactions. Missing minutes. Enough to disturb a careful mind, not enough to convict a protected one. Not without other evidence. Not without a witness who survived. Nolan had history on his side. Evelyn said. He'd pulled people from ditches, found a lost boy in whiteout when the state teams were ready to suspend the search, broke a poaching ring 5 years ago. Folks trusted him because they had reasons to. And because once a town decides who keeps it safe, Gideon said, it doesn't give that up cheaply. Dorian stared at Luke Pike's notes and felt, beneath exhaustion and grief, the first hard edge of alignment. This was no longer only about finding Rook. It was about pattern, leverage, and the old human sin of trusting the wrong man because he had once done the right thing in public. He spent the next hour at the table, while Gideon walked him through every marked location Luke had tracked. Abandoned logging spurs, creek crossings, blind pockets behind windbreak ridges, stretches of county land no one patrolled unless called. Evelyn spoke less, but when she did, it was often to correct the map in ways that mattered more than official labels. This fence line sagged now. That culvert had collapsed 2 winters ago. This trail held ice under powder and would slow a sled. Her knowledge was not investigative. It was intimate. The knowledge of a person who had walked the land long enough to see what changed and what pretended not to. Outside, darkness thickened early as it always did in deep winter. Patch snored under the bench. The black female dog in recovery lifted her head once, then settled. Somewhere farther in the house, a board creaked with the change in temperature. At last, Gideon sat back and rubbed one rough hand over his mouth. "If I help you," he said, "we do it clean. No charging off half-cocked because you're angry. No heroics. Nolan wins when men make themselves predictable." Dorian met his gaze. "I'm not looking for revenge." That was true, though not complete. He was looking for a dog, for truth, for the shape of a hand that had reached too close to his life and thought it could leave cleanly. Gideon seemed to hear the unfinished parts anyway. "No," he said. "You're looking for what I was looking for the week after Luke died. That's worse, because it feels righteous." The older man stood then, taking Luke's map with him. He moved to the wall near the lamp and pinned the page there with 2 rusted tacks, like a field commander returning to a war he had never officially stopped fighting. Dorian rose too, slower, exhaustion pulling at his bones. Evelyn came around the table and paused beside him. Her lined face had gone softer with sorrow, but not weaker. "You came back," she said. He looked down at Rook's collar lying on the table between the coffee rings and map edges. "I didn't have another move, Av. That's not what I meant." He understood then what she had meant, and why it mattered to her more. He had not run his shame out into the woods and wrapped himself in it. He had brought it into a room with other people in it and set it down where it could be seen. For a man like Dorian, that was as close to kneeling as life often required. When he finally picked the collar up again, he did it carefully, like handling a promise that had not yet failed but might still. The plan they began shaping that night was still rough, more instinct than structure, built from old notes, winter logic, and the accumulated patience of people who had spent too long being underestimated. It was not hope, not yet, but it was no longer one man walking blind into snow. And for the first time since Rook vanished, Dorian felt the smallest shift inside himself, not comfort, not relief, but a lessening of that brutal private loneliness which had made every trail feel like punishment. Gideon extinguished the lamp last. In the near dark, his voice came from the wall where Luke's map hung. "This is the last time I let him be alone in it," he said. Dorian did not answer. He did not need to. The room had already chosen sides. By the time they moved, the day had already gone colorless. Winter in that county often did that before a storm or after bad news. The sky lowered into one broad sheet of dirty white, flattening distance, stealing depth from the woods, making every stand of pine look nearer than it was, and every sound farther away. Dorian Hale moved through it with the grim steadiness of a man whose body was tired but no longer allowed itself to matter. Fatigue had burned through him days ago and left something colder in its place. Gideon led the first leg without speaking. The older man wore the same heavy canvas coat, stiff with old weather, and carried Luke's marked map folded into the inside breast pocket as if it were something alive enough to bruise. He moved with a laborer's stubborn balance rather than a hunter's grace, boots finding buried firmness by memory and instinct. The years had thickened his hands, roughed his face, silvered his beard, but grief had done the greater work on him. It had pared away anything decorative and left him built out of endurance, old anger, and the habits of a father who had spent too long replaying where one road should have turned. Evelyn came behind them with a canvas medical satchel banging softly against her hip. Her age showed in the way she conserved movement, not in weakness. She had wrapped her silver hair under a dark knit cap and wore the long, weather-faded coat Dorian had first seen in the storm. But now he noticed how often she looked not at the trail, but into the brush beyond it, as if counting the shapes that belonged there and the ones that did not. Dorian brought up the rear for the first mile, then shifted forward when the land narrowed between frozen creek bank and cedar thicket. The old military watch on his wrist had lost all meaning except as rhythm. Every few minutes he checked the tree line, the drifts, the break patterns on snow crust. He had his knife, a pry bar looped through a strap, and the empty absence of Rook beside him, more distracting than pain would have been. They were not alone, though only 3 of them walked. Twice that morning Evelyn found the signs of the others, who helped without naming themselves. A thermos left under a pine windbreak, still faintly warm. A strip of blue cloth tied to a low branch facing east, warning of a collapsed drainage trench ahead. Later, near a deer fence half buried in drifted snow, Gideon found a small bundle wrapped in feed sack cloth. Spare gauze, a dog muzzle, 2 heavy-duty cable cutters, and a note in blocky pencil script that said only, "Southridge Quiet Afternoon." No name, no signature. Just proof that the invisible hands around Evelyn's house had not vanished, only learned to move more carefully. "They still trust you," Dorian said. Evelyn adjusted the satchel strap. "No," she answered. "They trust what the dogs need." That stayed with him. It was near midday when they reached the old service road Luke had marked in 2 different inks, years apart. The first set of notes had belonged to his official patrol work. The second, harsher, darker, written after he had begun to suspect internal interference, ran like a correction over the earlier lines. Gideon stopped at the edge of the road and crouched without complaint despite the cold. He thought this was just transit, he said, brushing snow off a cut cedar post. Not storage, not operation. Movement? Dorian knelt too. There were tracks here, though half-weathered. Sled runners, 2 different widths. Boots, dogs, recent enough to matter. They started using it more heavily after he died, Gideon went on. That's what I couldn't prove. But the pattern changed. Dorian studied the compressed snow where runners had crossed and crossed again. They got confident. Or protected. No one said Nolan's name. They no longer had to. They moved west after that, staying inside the shadowed timber instead of following the service road directly. The trees grew thicker there, mostly fir and black spruce, branches heavy with old snow that dumped in muffled cascades whenever wind moved through. The air smelled of cold resin and iron. Once, a raven lifted from somewhere ahead and flapped off low and silent, too heavy a bird to seem like chance. It happened when they crested a low rise and looked down into a shallow basin, choked with young pine and weeded-over equipment remains. Evelyn caught Dorian's sleeve before he took the next step. At first he thought she had seen movement. What she had seen was a dog, not Rook. An old, brindled shepherd mix stood half-hidden between two rusting drums, ribs showing, muzzle scarred white over one side, ears notched from some older violence. Dorian recognized the kind of animal instantly, one that had lived too long between fear and survival to belong easily anywhere. Yet the dog was not running. He was watching them, watching Evelyn specifically. Her breath changed. "Ladder," she whispered. The name seemed impossible in such a place, and yet the dog's tail gave one stiff, uncertain motion at the sound. Not joy. Recognition. "He was here last winter," she said, voice barely more than air. "Caught in a snare by the quarry road. I thought he'd gone south." The dog did something stranger then. He did not approach. He turned his head once toward the basin below, then back toward them. Then again, as if impatient with their slowness, and disappeared through the brush. Dorian and Gideon exchanged one brief look. "He's showing us something," Evelyn said. Maybe another man would have dismissed that. Dorian had learned too much from Rook to insult instinct when it came dressed as animal choice. They followed. The basin opened beyond the spruce line into a hidden yard, shaped not by nature, but by neglect and use. Two weather-gray sheds leaned under the weight of old snow. A portable generator crouched under a tarp. 3 steel kennels had been hastily screened with camouflage netting, darkened by frost. And there, beyond them, tied off near a makeshift loading platform built from pallets and old fence rails, stood more dogs than Dorian could count in the first stunned second. Some were crated, some were staked. Some simply huddled against one another with the defeated stillness of animals too tired to spend energy on panic. And among them was Rook. Dorian knew him first by posture, not color. The shepherd stood tall despite the rope clipped to the black harness. His cream-gray-black coat had gone rough with wind and dirty snow. One side of his muzzle was darker with dried blood from some shallow cut. But the dog was upright, alert, and when his amber eyes lifted and found Dorian across the yard, nothing in him broke. He did not bark, he did not lunge, he held still. That hurt more than if he had cried out, because it meant Rook had spent whatever fear he'd had already and moved beyond it into waiting. Dorian's first instinct was a hard, reckless wave through the chest. Go now, fast, before thought ruined it. Training checked that instinct an instant later. He took in numbers, positions, approach angles, the nearest cover, the line of sight from the loading platform. 2 men near the sheds, 1 by the snowmobile. No Nolan. Yet. Gideon touched his arm once and pointed low. Another trap line had been laid around the clearing perimeter, disguised under powder and brush. Not for wolves, for interruption. "Careful," the old man breathed. Dorian nodded, then began moving left along the shadow of the tree line, bending low. Evelyn stayed back with the satchel, exactly where she had been told, though every line of her body leaned toward the dogs. One of the men by the shed stepped into better view. Broad-shouldered, dark beard, rough over a blunt jaw, knit cap pulled low, the kind of face built for small cruelties, rather than theatrical evil. He was carrying a cable pole. The other, thinner and younger, had a scar slicing through his eyebrow, and a limp too slight to slow him much. Neither had seen them yet. Dorian was 3 steps from breaking cover when a voice behind the platform said, calm as if greeting neighbors after church, "I wondered how long it would take you." Nolan Bryce stepped out from behind the nearest kennel. He wore his winter deputy coat zipped high against the cold, badge muted under frost, gloves neat, boots clean enough to insult the setting. He looked exactly as he always had in town. Controlled, reasonable, the kind of man people listened to without knowing why. Only now there was no audience left worth performing for. Gideon's face emptied. It was worse than rage. Rage still expected something from the world. Dorian straightened from the trees. "You knew from the start," he said. Nolan tilted his head slightly. "Yes." No denial, no dramatic pause. Just one plain syllable laid out on the snow. The broad man by the shed shifted, uncertain now. The younger one looked from Nolan to Dorian to the dogs, as if calculating odds and futures at once. Nolan went on, voice even. "I knew what Luke was finding. I knew what he'd walked into that night. I knew where he was when he called." Gideon took one step forward. The crust gave a sharp crack under his boot. Nolan looked at him then, and for the first time some older weariness flickered under the deputy's control. "He should have waited," Nolan said. "He was too eager to be right." Dorian felt the cold rise through him like poison. "He asked for help. He got an answer. Not the one he needed." Nolan's mouth thinned. "Do you think I don't know that?" It was the nearest thing to heat he had shown. For one brief stretched second, it seemed he might stop there. But men who had spent too long justifying themselves often mistook speech for absolution. "I could have gone in hard," Nolan said. "Could have pulled half the county into it, blown open the whole line, let them scatter before we knew how deep it ran. Or I could hold and follow and build something that lasted longer than one brave fool with a radio." Gideon's voice came out low enough to seem torn from wood. "You let him freeze." Nolan looked back at him and did not flinch. "I let time make the choice," he said, and when I realized what it had cost, it was too late to undo it. The confession hung there, ugly and insufficient, not remorse, not pride, something fouler, a man still trying to make delay sound strategic. Then his gaze shifted to Dorian. "And you," he said. "I had to get them away from you. Someone like you arrives, starts pulling at threads, and people stop listening to the ones who actually understand what keeps a place standing." Dorian took another step. "What keeps it standing?" Nolan looked at the dogs, the sheds, the trap line. "Compromise?" The younger, scar-browed man broke first. He swore softly, dropped the rope in his hand, and ran for the far side of the yard, where a cut in the brush led downslope. The broad man moved half a heartbeat later, not after Dorian, but after the snowmobile. Instinct tried to split the world into targets and priorities, and at that exact moment, one of the staked dogs gave a strangled scream. Dorian looked. A rangy white and brown cattle dog, maybe 3 years old, had thrashed hard enough against a hidden side chain to wrench the steel loop deeper into his hind leg. Blood darkened the snow beneath him in sudden, frightening volume. Panic had turned all his strength against him. Dorian could have pursued Nolan. He saw the line of it clearly. Vault the pallet edge, cut across the kennels, intercept near the brush choke before the deputy reached the lower path. Instead, he pivoted toward the dog. He did not think. He chose. Behind him, Gideon made a sound. Whether fury or understanding, Dorian could not tell. He dropped to one knee in the blood-splashed snow, knife out, one hand pinning the dog's shoulders just enough to keep the animal from breaking the leg entirely. The dog snapped once, blind with pain, then froze when another body moved in close. Rook. The German shepherd had torn free sometime during the chaos. Dorian saw the loose rope dragging from the harness, and now stood shoulder to shoulder with him, body braced between the wounded dog and the open yard. Not attacking. Guarding. Eyes fixed outward. Then, in a movement so quiet it seemed almost ceremonial, latter stepped from the shadow of the drums and took position too. And another dog rose from the nearest kennel, and another, not charging, not heroic in any human sense, simply standing, forming a ragged, living barrier in front of Evelyn as she came running forward with the satchel. No one had to tell the broad man by the snowmobile to hesitate. He did it because instinct recognized when a yard had ceased belonging to him. Dorian cut the chain. The cattle dog collapsed against his arm, shaking, alive. When he looked up again, Nolan was gone into the trees. So was the younger runner. Snow had already begun the long work of taking their tracks, but the dogs were still here. Rook pressed once, hard and brief, against Dorian's shoulder, as if counting him back into the world. And Dorian, kneeling in blood and frost with a half-saved animal in his hands and a fugitive deputy vanishing into the winter, understood with painful clarity exactly what kind of man he was. Not the kind who hunted best. The kind who stayed when something living still needed him. They did not chase the dark. By the time the last of the dogs had been cut free and the blood on the snow had begun to dull from red to black, the woods beyond the hidden yard had already swallowed Nolan Bryce and the man who ran with him. The stormlight was fading fast, sinking toward that iron-blue northern dusk that came early and without sentiment. Chasing men into timber under those conditions would have meant gambling the living for the sake of anger. Dorian Hale had made his choice already. Now he had to keep making it. He moved through the yard with the hard, deliberate focus of a man whose body knew how to postpone collapse. He was exhausted in every place exhaustion could live. Behind the eyes, in the shoulders, in the small joints of the hands, in the quiet part of the mind where judgment had to stay clear, even when grief wanted to cloud it. His old military gray tactical shirt clung damply under his coat, dark at the seams with sweat that the cold had not yet taken. His square jaw had gone rough with several days' worth of beard growth, but the discipline of his face remained. The clean angles, the stillness, the refusal to waste energy on anything that did not immediately matter. Rook never left his side. The German shepherd limped only slightly, a stiffness more than a wound, and that alone made Dorian grateful in a way he did not have language for. The dog's sable coat was dirty with meltwater and kennel filth, his black harness scraped and missing one strap loop, but his amber eyes were steady. Not once did he behave like an animal recently captured. He moved with the same restrained certainty he always had, checking the freed dogs, circling back, watching the tree line without dramatics. Relief in him took the shape of work. Evelyn Pike knelt by the cattle dog, whose leg Dorian had saved from the chain, wrapping it with strips torn from an old feed sack and pinned with gauze from her bag. Her hands were red and shaking, but no shakiness entered the work itself. She had become that kind of woman through repetition, silver hair escaping her wool cap, narrow face made older by winter and worry, gray eyes still sharp enough to see what could be saved and what could not. Her tenderness had never been soft. It had edges. It had procedure. It had learned to function in bad weather. Gideon stood at the center of the yard, turning slowly in place, taking in the cleared traps, the open kennels, the stacked crates, the scraps of paper nailed to the interior wall of the loading platform. The old man's broad frame seemed bent not by age now, but by the strain of being this close to the thing that had hollowed his life, and yet finding no satisfaction in it. Rage had carried him a long way. It had not prepared him for evidence. "Get the papers," he said at last, voice flat from somewhere deep. "Anything with numbers, routes, names, don't trust the fire barrel. If they burned records, they'll be ash with staples." Dorian looked at him once, understood, and went. The hidden camp yielded its proof reluctantly, but not fully enough. A ledger wrapped in oilcloth and shoved under a broken pallet. Trap invoices paid in cash. Fuel receipts for snowmobiles that should never have been in county use. A stained clipboard with kennel counts marked by initials instead of names. 2 radio batteries stamped with sheriff's supply inventory, 1 still working, 1 dead. A lockbox beneath the work table holding syringes, veterinary sedatives, and tags from dogs already gone. The ugliest truths were often administrative. They loaded everything they could into the truck and Gideon's old sled. The rescued dogs, once movement became possible, broke into 3 kinds of animal. Some tried desperately to stay near human legs, frantic with the terror of being left again. Some resisted every hand, every rope, every crate, choosing panic over trust because panic was familiar. Others, the worst off, simply let themselves be moved with a stillness that frightened Dorian more than struggling would have. He had seen that kind of stillness in wounded men, too, the body deciding there was no point in resistance until shown otherwise. They made 2 trips to Evelyn's place before full dark. By then the little house had changed from refuge into field hospital. Blankets covered the floor. Bowls of thawed broth and water lined the walls. Patch, the old sandy-brown dog with the cloudy eye and the crooked ear, paced from room to room with solemn duty, sniffing each new arrival, and then retreating as though acknowledging them into some older, gentler order. Ladder lay near the door, brindled head on his paws, watching with the grave patience of a dog who knew enough of human hurt to keep still around it. The new person arrived an hour later, driving too fast for the road and too carefully for panic. The pickup that stopped outside was mud-spattered, pale blue under the dirt, with a magnetic veterinary placard clinging half-crooked to the driver's door. When the engine cut, a woman stepped out carrying 2 hard cases and a rolled canvas kit under one arm. She crossed the yard without hesitation, boots finding the buried stone path by instinct rather than sight. Dr. June Kessler was perhaps in her early 40s, medium height, compactly built, her winter coat zipped to the throat over dark scrub pants and thick socks shoved into practical insulated boots. Her face was narrow and intelligent, the bones clean under wind-reddened skin, and her dark hair had been twisted into a low knot that the drive had partially defeated. She did not waste time on charm. Her eyes, a clear brown, quick and exact, went over the porch, the dog hair, the blood on Dorian's sleeve, Gideon's expression, and the stack of confiscated gear by the stove in one sweep that seemed to sort urgency by category. "How many?" she asked. "7 mobile, 3 that may not be by morning, 2 worse than that," Evelyn answered. June nodded once, already kneeling by the nearest crate. "Good. You counted before you panicked." If the line held humor, it was dry enough to be sterile. She worked for the next hour without rest, and Dorian understood quickly why people trusted her. Not because she was warm, because she was exact. She touched wounds with the detached care of someone who understood pain, but refused to sentimentalize it. She identified cable abrasions, paw frostbite, shoulder strain from tether fighting, and sedative residue at one injection site on a black hound mix, whose eyes rolled white with fear. "This wasn't opportunistic," she said while checking the hound's gums. "This was managed." Her voice had the crisp, unornamented cadence of a professional who had long ago learned that comfort came second to clarity. "Same restraint method on at least 3, same angle of pull damage, and these—" She lifted a syringe cap from the evidence pile with tweezers. "These match the veterinary sedative lot reported missing from county storage in November." Gideon looked up sharply. Dorian said, "Can you put that in writing?" June met his gaze, taking him in properly for the first time. The height, the discipline in the body even while spent. The roughened face that had not quite given itself permission to feel what had happened yet. "I can do better than that," she said. "I can testify to it." That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like another weight laid on the table. June had sedated one dog for stitching. Evelyn was heating more water, and Gideon sat before Luke's box of papers, matching old notes to new receipts. When Rook, who had finally lowered himself near the stove, rose without warning and crossed the room to the pile of seized items. He pushed past the ledger and pawed once, twice, at the bottom of the stack, until a narrow object slid free from under the lockbox and clattered onto the floor. A sheriff's whistle. Old brass, darkened with tarnish, except where human fingers had polished it years before. A small engraved line on the side caught the lamplight. L. Pike. No one spoke. Gideon picked it up as if it might burn him. The old man's rough thumb moved across the engraved initials and stopped there. "He carried this off duty," he said, but the words were not really for the room. "Said radios failed faster than lungs." For one suspended moment, every sound in the house seemed to recede. The stove, the dogs, the winter wind pressing at the panes, until there was only the tiny metal object in Gideon's hand and the impossible feeling that the dead had reached through a heap of evidence to tap one living shoulder. Rook went back to the stove and lay down again, as if he had merely retrieved what was needed. Nothing about the night after that felt accidental. By dawn, they had enough to move from suspicion into exposure. June drafted injury reports in tight, efficient handwriting. Dates, wound patterns, likely restraint times, evidence of sedation, signs of prolonged tethering. Dorian sorted ledgers against fuel receipts and noted the sheriff's inventory numbers on the radio batteries. Evelyn made a list of the dogs she knew by name and the ones she did not, noting where each had first been seen, when they disappeared, when they reappeared, if they did. The network of quiet helpers began to show itself again, too. Before sunrise, someone left sacks of kibble on the porch. After dawn, an old man from the grain co-op delivered straw without knocking and drove off before Thanks could catch him. Near noon, Ruth Bell from the general store arrived with coffee, canned soup, and the kind of tight mouth that meant she was angrier at herself than at anyone else. "I should have known," she said to no one in particular, setting down the bags. "He always did talk too smoothly." Nobody reassured her. Regret had work to do. Nolan was not caught that day. He was too practiced for that, too familiar with back roads, abandoned deer camps, lake-edge service shacks, and the kind of favors old corruption buys before it runs out. But by afternoon, with June's signed reports copied, the ledger photographed, Luke Pike's papers cross-referenced, and the stolen county inventory tagged to the camp, the shape of his protection had changed. He was no longer a respected deputy under suspicion in one house at the edge of the pines. He was a wanted man with nowhere clean left to stand. The county did not transform all at once after that. People did not become brave merely because truth had been named. But something loosened. The careful distance around Dorian eased first in glances, then in the practical language of work. A farmer with a plow cleared Evelyn's drive without being asked. 2 teenage boys repaired broken kennel boards in embarrassed silence. A widow from across the ridge sent old quilts. The invisible circle that had protected dogs in secret began, little by little, to include people in daylight. Late that evening, Gideon stood alone before Luke's open file. The house had gone quieter at last. Most of the rescued dogs were sleeping or trying to. June had left with promises to return at first light. Evelyn was in the back room mending a harness strap by lamp glow. Dorian stood in the doorway between kitchen and front room with Rook at his leg and did not interrupt. Gideon held Luke's whistle in one hand and rested the other on the page that recorded the final call time. His shoulders looked older from the back. Smaller, too. Grief was no lighter for having been proved right. At length he said, not turning, "This time, I came in time." The sentence did not sound triumphant. It sounded like the closing of a wound that would ache forever anyway. Evelyn opened the front door before full dark the next morning and did not close it again. People came carefully at first, one by one, with feed, with old fencing, with medicines, with silence, with awkward offers of labor that tried not to look like apology. She greeted every one of them the same way she had always greeted frightened dogs, without drama, without pressure, but with the unmistakable steadiness of a person making room. And Dorian stayed, not because he had nowhere else to go. That was the lie lonely people told themselves to avoid admitting choice. He stayed because the old shape of his life, arrive, endure, leave, had broken somewhere between the hidden yard and the house full of breathing animals and stubborn human hands. Something else had taken root in its place. Not peace. Peace was too grand a word, something smaller and truer, a reason to remain visible. On the third clear evening after Nolan's name went out beyond the county line, Dorian sat on the porch step, while the cold turned the snowfield pink, then blue. Rook lay against his leg, warm and heavy in the way only a trusted dog could be. Out in the yard, 3 of the rescued dogs moved carefully between the shoveled paths, no longer startled by every sound. One of them, a rangy young mixed breed with one white paw and a cautious gait, paused at the bottom step and looked up. Dorian held still. The dog came closer, each pace uncertain, then set his narrow head against Dorian's hand. Not a plea, a decision. Dorian exhaled slowly and let his fingers rest against the coarse winter fur. "In here," he said quietly, more to the dog than to himself. "No one waits for someone who never comes?" Rook lifted his head once, then settled again. Behind them, through the open door, came the sound of human voices and bowls being set down, and a woman's tired laugh that did not need permission. Outside, winter remained exactly what it had always been. Inside, it was no longer faced alone. Sometimes, the greatest miracle is not fire from heaven or a voice in the wind. Sometimes it is much quieter than that. It is the right soul arriving before it is too late. It is a hand that refuses to let go. It is a wounded life finding shelter in the middle of a storm. And maybe that is how God often works in this world. Not always through spectacle, but through people who choose compassion when turning away would be easier. In everyday life, many of us are surrounded by quiet suffering we almost do not notice. A lonely neighbor, a hurting animal, a tired heart hiding behind a smile. We may not be able to save everyone, but we can still become part of someone else's miracle. One act of kindness, one moment of courage, one decision to show up. These things matter more than we know. They may even be the answer to someone's prayer. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or tell us about a moment when kindness changed your life. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and bring peace to every burden you are carrying. May He watch over you and the ones you love, and may His mercy follow you even through the coldest seasons of life.